The alarm at Camp Ironmore did not wait for anyone to be ready. Red lights spun across the walls of the command hall as officers rushed in, boots slamming against the floor, radios crackling with half-finished sentences. Colonel Grant Whitfield stood at the head of the long steel table, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the chaos around him. At the far end of that table sat a single empty chair. Nobody touched it. Nobody dared to. It had been empty for 6 years, yet everyone in the room walked around it like it was still occupied by someone who could see them. "Convoy 3 is gone," a young officer shouted, slamming a tablet onto the table. "We lost contact at the ridge line." Whitfield slammed his fist down. "How many?" 12. Maybe more." The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by static. Whitfield looked at the empty chair, and for a moment, something like doubt crossed his face. He quickly buried it. "We don't need ghosts," he muttered. "We need soldiers." Outside, the wind howled across the training yard, kicking dust into the eyes of new recruits who had no idea what was happening inside. Among them stood Sergeant Dylan Frost, arms crossed, watching the command hall with a frown. He had heard the stories. Everyone had. The chair inside was not just furniture. It was a promise, made years ago, that someone would return. Most people at Camp Ironmore thought that promise was a lie, told to comfort the grieving. They laughed about the chair when the officers were not listening. They called it the throne of nobody. Some of the newer recruits even joked about sitting in it, daring each other during quiet nights, only to be dragged away by older soldiers who remembered exactly why nobody should ever try. Dylan did not laugh. Dylan remembered. He was only a boy when it happened, living in the small town near the base with his mother, who worked as a nurse for the camp's medical unit. He remembered the night the sky lit up orange from an explosion at the northern outpost. He remembered the chaos, the shouting, the way half the town ran toward the base instead of away from it, desperate for news of their sons and daughters stationed there. And he remembered the name that everyone whispered that night: Colonel Marcus Vane. Vane had been the most respected officer at Camp Ironmore, a man who never lost a mission, never left a soldier behind, and never once raised his voice, even when the world around him was burning. When the northern outpost came under a devastating assault, it was Vane who led the counter-response, pulling dozens of trapped soldiers out from collapsing buildings, while enemy fire tore through the smoke. He saved everyone that night, everyone except himself. His body was never found. Some said he was captured, some said he escaped and simply chose never to return. Most believed he had died somewhere in that inferno, buried under rubble that no rescue team could fully search in time. But Camp Ironmore refused to accept an ending without proof, so they built a tradition instead. They kept his chair at the table, untouched, unclaimed, as a silent vow that if he ever came back, his place would be waiting. 6 years passed. The vow slowly became a joke to the newer generation. "Convoy 3, does anyone copy?" The radio operator repeated, voice cracking with tension. Static. Then nothing. Whitfield exhaled sharply and turned toward the map table. "Send Falcon Squad, immediately." "Sir, Falcon Squad already deployed 2 hours ago. They haven't checked in either." The room grew colder. 2 units gone in one night meant something out there was not behaving like the usual raiders, who occasionally tested the base's perimeter. This felt organized, calculated. Whitfield rubbed his temples, doing his best to hide the fear creeping into his chest. Outside, Dylan noticed a strange stillness settle over the camp, the kind that came right before something enormous happened. He could not explain it, but his instincts screamed at him to pay attention. He glanced toward the main gate and saw a lone figure standing there, motionless, wrapped in a long weathered coat, a hood pulled low over their face. At first, the sentries assumed it was a lost traveler. One of them, a young private named Oliver Banks, jogged toward the figure with his rifle lowered but ready. "This is a restricted military zone," Oliver said, trying to sound firm despite his nerves. "State your name and business." The figure did not answer immediately. Their gaze swept across the camp, the watchtowers, the fences, the flickering lights, as though comparing it to a memory from long ago. Then, in a low and steady voice, they finally spoke. "I need to speak with whoever is in command." Oliver hesitated, unsure whether to laugh or call for backup. The stranger's tone carried an unusual weight, calm yet unshakable, the kind of voice that made people listen even when they didn't want to. "And who exactly should I say is asking?" The stranger paused, then lowered their hood, just enough to reveal tired eyes and a face marked with old scars. "Tell them an old friend is here to help with Convoy 3. Word spread through the base faster than any alarm could. By the time Dylan heard about the stranger at the gate, half the camp was already buzzing with curiosity and suspicion. Some soldiers assumed it was a scout from a rival unit. Others feared it might be an infiltrator testing their defenses. Whitfield, still furious over the missing convoys, ordered the stranger brought directly to the command hall, prepared to make an example out of whoever thought they could walk into Camp Ironmore uninvited. When the stranger stepped into the hall, escorted by 2 guards, the room went quiet. Their coat was torn at the edges, boots caked with dried mud from terrain far rougher than anything near the base. They carried no weapon, no insignia, nothing to identify them, yet their presence made even seasoned officers straighten their posture without realizing it. Whitfield crossed his arms. "You have 30 seconds to explain why you're here, before I have you removed." The stranger's eyes drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the empty chair at the end of the table. For a heartbeat, something flickered across their expression, something between grief and recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by the same calm composure as before. "Your convoy didn't fail because of bad luck," the stranger said. "They were led into a trap, a well-planned one. If you send another unit blindly, you'll lose them too." A few officers scoffed. One of them, a broad-shouldered captain named Reggie Holt, stepped forward with a mocking grin. "And you know this because you're some kind of fortune teller." "I know this because I've seen this pattern before," the stranger replied evenly. "Whoever is behind this wants you to keep sending soldiers out one group at a time." Panic response. It's a tactic used to drain a base slowly instead of attacking it directly. Whitfield studied the stranger for a long moment, torn between suspicion and the uncomfortable realization that the theory made sense. Still, pride and stress made him defensive. "We don't take orders from strangers who wander in off the road." "I'm not giving you orders," the stranger said. "I'm giving you a warning." Reggie laughed, shaking his head. "Cute speech. Someone escort our mysterious hero out before." Before he could finish, the ground shook. A distant explosion lit the night sky beyond the camp's western perimeter, sending a wave of dust rolling across the yard. Alarms blared once more, this time in a different pattern, indicating a direct assault rather than a lost convoy. Soldiers scrambled to their positions, shouting orders, grabbing gear, the entire base plunging into controlled chaos. The stranger did not flinch. If anything, their expression sharpened, focused, like a soldier stepping back into familiar territory after years away from it. "That's the second wave," the stranger said calmly. "They're pushing toward the fuel depot. If that goes up, you'll lose more than convoys." Whitfield's face paled. The fuel depot was the single most vulnerable point on the base, something only someone with intimate knowledge of Camp Ironmore's old layout would know. Layout that had not been public knowledge in years. "How do you know that?" Whitfield demanded. The stranger met his gaze without hesitation. "Because I helped design the base's defense grid myself, a long time ago." The room went silent again, this time heavier, filled with unspoken questions nobody was ready to ask aloud. Outside, gunfire echoed in the distance, sharp and rapid, mixing with the shouts of soldiers trying to hold their ground against an enemy they still couldn't fully see. Whitfield's hands curled into fists at his sides, torn between disbelief and the undeniable urgency of the moment. "Prove it," Whitfield finally said. "Help us stop this attack, and maybe I'll believe whatever story you're trying to tell." The stranger gave a small, tired nod, as though they had expected nothing less. "Get your soldiers to fall back from the western fence. Let them think they're winning, then hit them from the ridge when they funnel through the gap near the old supply road." Reggie crossed his arms, still skeptical. "And who's supposed to lead that ambush? You?" The stranger's eyes hardened, and for the first time, something dangerous flickered beneath the calm exterior, a presence that made even Reggie take an involuntary step back. "If you'll let me," the stranger said quietly, "I'll show you exactly why that chair has been empty for 6 years." Outside, the fighting intensified, flashes of light cutting through the darkness like violent heartbeats. Somewhere in that chaos, Camp Ironmore was about to discover that the legend they had mocked, doubted, and slowly forgotten was standing right in front of them, waiting only for permission to remind them who they used to fear the most. Dylan pushed through the crowd gathering near the command hall entrance, desperate to catch a glimpse of the stranger everyone was suddenly whispering about. When he finally saw the face beneath that worn hood, illuminated briefly by a flare of distant gunfire, something in his chest tightened. It was a face he had only seen once before, in an old faded photograph his mother kept hidden in a drawer she rarely opened. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Because standing there, scarred and weathered but unmistakably real, was the man the entire camp had spent 6 years pretending not to wait for. The night was far from over, and Camp Ironmore was about to learn that legends do not disappear. They simply wait for the right moment to return. Whitfield did not have time to argue further. The gunfire beyond the western fence grew louder, and every second spent debating was a second the base could not afford. He turned to Reggie, his voice sharp and final. "Pull the line back. Do exactly what he says." Reggie hesitated, clearly unhappy, but years of discipline overrode his doubt. He barked orders into his radio, and within moments, soldiers along the western fence began a controlled retreat, falling back toward the ridge as instructed. From a distance, it looked like a collapse. Up close, it was a trap being set with careful precision. The stranger moved through the command hall with a quiet authority that made even the most stubborn officers step aside. They studied the base map for only a few seconds, before pointing to a narrow gap near the old supply road, a route most soldiers had forgotten existed, since it had been sealed off years ago. "They'll push through there," the stranger said. "It's the only blind spot left once the western fence falls back. Whoever planned this attack knows the base's old layout, which means they either studied it carefully or someone leaked it." Whitfield's eyes narrowed. "You think we have someone feeding information to the enemy?" "I think you should worry about that after tonight," the stranger replied. "Right now, your soldiers need cover on that ridge, and they need it fast." Dylan, still standing near the entrance, felt his pulse quicken. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "I know that ridge. I used to hike it as a kid before it was sealed off." The stranger turned to him, studying his face for a long moment. Something about the recognition in that gaze made Dylan's breath catch, but there was no time to ask questions. "Then you're coming with me," the stranger said simply. Whitfield opened his mouth to object, but the stranger was already moving toward the door, grabbing a discarded rifle from a nearby rack with practiced ease. Dylan hesitated only a second before following, adrenaline drowning out any fear he might have felt walking straight into gunfire beside a man nobody could fully explain. Outside, the world had become a storm of noise and flashing light. Soldiers shouted commands, moved in coordinated bursts, and ducked behind whatever cover they could find, as return fire cracked through the darkness. The stranger moved through it all with unnerving calm, reading the chaos like a language only they understood. "Stay low," the stranger told Dylan as they crossed toward the ridge path. "Watch my movements, not the noise around you. Noise will get you killed. Focus gets you home." Dylan nodded, gripping his weapon tighter, doing his best to match the stranger's pace despite his legs trembling with nerves. They reached the ridge just as the first wave of attackers began funneling through the gap near the old supply road, exactly where the stranger predicted. For a moment, everything went still. Then, the stranger moved. It was not aggressive or wild. It was precise, almost elegant, each motion calculated to disable, rather than destroy where possible. Disarm, rather than provoke further violence. Soldiers on the ridge, initially confused by the sudden shift in strategy, quickly fell into rhythm once they saw the stranger's plan unfolding, cutting off the enemy's advance and forcing a retreat within minutes. The attackers, clearly expecting an easy push through a collapsing defense, found themselves caught in a controlled ambush instead. Confusion spread through their ranks as they realized the coordinated fallback had been a deliberate lure. Within a short time, their advance broke entirely, and what remained of their forces scattered into the darkness beyond the ridge. When the gunfire finally faded and silence settled back over Camp Ironmore, soldiers stood in stunned disbelief, staring at the stranger who had just turned their retreat into a decisive victory. Dylan lowered his weapon slowly, chest heaving, staring at the same face he had only known from an old photograph. "You're him," Dylan said quietly, almost to himself. "You're Colonel Vane." The stranger, no longer bothering to hide behind vague answers, finally allowed a tired, faint smile. "It's been a long time since anyone called me that." Word of the Ridge ambush spread through the base within minutes, carried by soldiers still buzzing with adrenaline. By the time Vane returned to the command hall, the room was packed, officers and enlisted soldiers alike crowding in, desperate to see the man responsible for turning near disaster into a swift victory. Whitfield stood near the table, arms crossed, studying Vane with an expression caught between relief and deep unease. Vane's return complicated everything, not just militarily, but personally. Whitfield had built his authority over the past 6 years, partly by moving the base beyond its dependence on legends and myths. Vane's presence threatened to undo that in a single night. "You have a lot of explaining to do," Whitfield said finally. "I do," Vane agreed. "But first, your convoys. Falcon Squad and Convoy 3. If they're still alive, we don't have much time." Whitfield hesitated, torn between pride and urgency. Eventually, urgency won. "Show me what you know." Vane approached the map table, tracing possible routes with practiced familiarity, explaining terrain features long forgotten by the current command staff. As he spoke, it became clear that his knowledge of the region went far deeper than anyone currently serving at Camp Ironmore. Officers who had once dismissed the empty chair as an outdated tradition now found themselves hanging on his every word. Reggie, still uneasy about the sudden shift in authority, crossed his arms. "Even if you know the terrain, that doesn't mean we should just hand over command to someone who vanished for 6 years without a word." Vane did not react with anger. Instead, his expression grew heavier, weighted by something deeply personal. "I didn't vanish by choice," he said quietly. "I was captured the night of the outpost collapse. It took years to escape, and even longer to find my way back here." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. Whitfield studied him carefully, searching for any sign of deception, but found none. Only exhaustion, restrained grief, and a quiet determination that had clearly kept him alive through circumstances most people could not imagine. Dylan, still standing near the back of the room, felt a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. Growing up, he had heard countless stories about Vane's bravery, stories that felt more like folklore than reality. Seeing the man now, weathered and human rather than untouchable, made those stories feel real for the first time. "We need to move now if we want any chance of finding the missing units alive," Vane said, refocusing the room's attention. "Every hour we wait decreases their chances significantly." Whitfield exhaled sharply, weighing the political complications against the immediate crisis. Finally he nodded. "Fine. You'll advise the rescue operation. But make no mistake, this doesn't mean I'm handing you control of this base." "I don't want control," Vane replied simply. "I want my people home." The rescue operation was assembled quickly, combining soldiers eager to prove themselves with veterans who still remembered Vane's reputation from years before. Dylan volunteered without hesitation, ignoring the nervous glances from soldiers around him, who questioned whether a support staff member belonged in a combat rescue unit. As the team prepared to move out, Vane approached Dylan directly, studying him with a curious expression. "Your mother worked in the medical unit," Vane said. It wasn't a question. Dylan blinked, surprised. "You remember her?" "I remember everyone who helped keep this base standing," Vane replied. "She saved a lot of lives during the outpost collapse, including mine, more than once, before everything fell apart." Dylan felt a lump form in his throat, memories of his mother's quiet sadness over the years, suddenly making painful sense. She had never spoken much about that night, but her silence had always carried a weight he couldn't fully understand until now. "She thought you were gone," Dylan said softly. Vane's expression tightened, guilt flickering across his features. "I know. I wanted to come back sooner. Circumstances made that impossible." Before Dylan could respond, Whitfield's voice cut through the moment, calling the team to formation. Vane straightened, the brief vulnerability replaced once more by focused resolve. "We'll talk more when this is over," he said. "Right now, we have people counting on us." The rescue team moved out under cover of darkness, following coordinates Vane provided based on old knowledge of enemy movement patterns in the region. The terrain grew increasingly rough as they advanced, rocky paths winding through dense brush that made visibility difficult and progress slow. Halfway through their approach, Vane raised a hand, signaling the team to stop. Something in his expression shifted, alert and calculating, scanning the surrounding darkness with practiced precision. "We're being watched," he said quietly. The team tensed, weapons raised, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then, from the shadows ahead, a figure emerged, hands raised in a gesture of surrender rather than aggression. It was one of the missing soldiers from Falcon's squad, injured but alive, relief washing over his exhausted face as he recognized the uniforms approaching him. "They're holding the rest of us about a mile north," the soldier said, voice trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. "They're planning something bigger. I heard them talking about hitting the base directly this time, not just picking off convoys." Vane's jaw tightened, the pieces of a larger, more dangerous plan beginning to form in his mind. Whatever they were facing tonight was not a random assault. It was the opening move of something far more calculated, something aimed directly at Camp Ironmore's heart. "Take him back to base," Vane instructed two soldiers near the rear of the formation. "The rest of us keep moving. We need those soldiers back, and we need answers about what's coming next." Dylan tightened his grip on his weapon, adrenaline mixing with a growing sense of purpose. Whatever legend Vane had once been, tonight was proving he was far from finished, and Camp Ironmore was only beginning to understand just how much they needed him. As the team pressed deeper into unfamiliar territory, the distant sound of voices and movement ahead confirmed the soldiers' warning. Whatever waited for them in the darkness was larger, more organized, and far more dangerous than a simple raid. Vane's expression hardened into something colder, more focused, the calm composure of earlier giving way to the sharp instincts of a warrior who had survived far worse than a single night of chaos. "Stay close," he told the team quietly, "and trust me completely. Tonight is only the beginning." The camp ahead was smaller than expected, a cluster of makeshift shelters hidden beneath a canopy of trees, lit only by a few dim lanterns scattered across the ground. Vane crouched low behind a fallen log, studying the layout with careful precision, while the rest of the team spread out silently along the perimeter. "6 guards visible," Vane whispered. "There will be more we can't see. Move quietly, disable quickly, and keep your focus on getting our people out first." Dylan nodded, his heart pounding against his ribs as he mirrored Vane's movements, staying low, staying silent. The training he had gone through felt distant compared to the reality of this moment, every sense heightened, every sound suddenly significant. Vane moved first, slipping through the shadows with a fluid precision that made it seem as though the darkness itself was cooperating with him. One guard fell without a sound, disarmed and restrained before he could raise an alarm. Another followed moments later, caught off guard by Vane's sudden appearance from an angle he clearly hadn't anticipated. The rest of the team moved in coordinated silence, following the plan Vane had outlined only minutes before. Within a short time, the remaining guards were subdued, and the small camp fell under their control without a single shot fired. Relief spread through the group as they located the missing soldiers from Convoy 3 and Falcon Squad, exhausted and bound but very much alive. As the team worked quickly to free them, one of the soldiers, a young private named Caleb Ward, looked up at Vane with wide, disbelieving eyes. "You're really him," Caleb said, voice hoarse from hours of captivity. "I didn't believe the stories. I thought the empty chair was just something people made up to feel better." Vane knelt beside him, checking his injuries with practiced care. "Sometimes the truth takes longer to arrive than the stories do. Save your strength. We're getting you home." As the rescued soldiers were gathered and prepared for the journey back, one of them, a wiry man with a nervous energy that immediately caught Vane's attention, kept glancing toward the tree line, as though expecting something. Vane studied him carefully, instincts sharpened by years of experience recognizing behavior that didn't quite fit. "What's your name?" Vane asked calmly. "Sergeant Miles Dunbar," the man replied quickly, avoiding direct eye contact. Vane said nothing further, but he made a mental note, filing away the small inconsistency for later. The priority remained getting everyone back to base safely, but something about Dunbar's demeanor felt deliberately rehearsed, too controlled for someone who had supposedly just endured hours of captivity alongside the others. The journey back to Camp Ironmore passed without further incident, though tension remained high among the group, everyone acutely aware that tonight's events were far from over. As they approached the base gates, soldiers on watch erupted into hushed murmurs of disbelief and relief, word spreading quickly that the rescue mission had succeeded. Whitfield met them at the entrance, his expression a complicated mixture of relief and reluctant respect. He studied Vane for a long moment before finally speaking. "You did what I wasn't sure was possible tonight. We did it together," Vane replied simply, glancing toward the exhausted soldiers around him. "This isn't about proving anything. It's about bringing people home." Despite the victory, Vane's expression remained guarded, his mind clearly still processing the larger threat looming beyond tonight's events. As the rescued soldiers were escorted toward medical care, Vane pulled Whitfield aside, keeping his voice low. "This wasn't a simple raid," Vane said. "Whoever planned this has detailed knowledge of the base's old defenses, personnel movements, and terrain. That kind of information doesn't come from outside observation alone." Whitfield's jaw tightened. "You think someone here is feeding them information?" "I think it's worth investigating quietly before assuming anything," Vane replied. "Tonight's attack felt like a test, not a full assault. Whoever is behind this is studying your response, learning your patterns." Whitfield exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples as the weight of the situation settled over him. 6 years of steady leadership suddenly felt fragile against the reality that something far more calculated was unfolding beneath the surface of Camp Ironmore. Over the following days, the base fell into a strange rhythm, caught between celebrating Vane's unexpected return and grappling with the unsettling implications of his warnings. Soldiers who once dismissed the empty chair as an outdated tradition now found themselves watching Vane with a mixture of awe and curiosity, eager to understand the man behind the legend. Dylan, in particular, found himself drawn to Vane's presence, spending time assisting with debriefings and quietly absorbing lessons from a man whose calm authority felt vastly different from the rigid discipline he had grown used to under Whitfield's command. During one training session, Vane paused mid-instruction, studying Dylan carefully. "You remind me of your mother," Vane said. "Steady under pressure, focused when it matters most." Dylan felt a swell of pride mixed with lingering grief. "She never talks about what happened that night." "Not really. Some memories are too heavy to carry in words," Vane replied. "But you honor her by choosing to stand here, ready to help others, instead of letting fear control you." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden commotion near the base's outer perimeter. A soldier came running, breathless, informing them that Sergeant Dunbar had been spotted attempting to access a restricted communications terminal late at night, an area strictly off-limits to anyone below a certain rank. Vane's expression hardened instantly, his earlier suspicions resurfacing with renewed urgency. "Where is he now?" "Detained near the eastern barracks, sir," the soldier replied. Vane moved quickly, Dylan following close behind, both making their way toward the detention area where Dunbar sat under guard, visibly nervous but attempting to maintain a composed expression. Whitfield arrived shortly after, clearly frustrated by yet another complication threatening the fragile stability of the base. "Explain yourself," Whitfield demanded, standing over Dunbar with barely restrained anger. Dunbar hesitated, glancing nervously between Whitfield and Vane before finally speaking. "I wasn't trying to sabotage anything. I was scared. They threatened my family if I didn't provide information during my capture. I never meant for anyone to get hurt." The room fell into a heavy silence. Vane studied Dunbar carefully, recognizing the genuine fear behind his admission, rather than deliberate malice. Years of experience had taught him the difference between a traitor acting out of greed and someone trapped by circumstances beyond their control. "Who threatened your family?" Vane asked calmly. Dunbar swallowed hard. "I don't know his name. He wore a mask during our meetings. But he knew things about this base that no outsider should know. Old blueprints, supply schedules, even personnel records." Vane's expression grew increasingly troubled as Dunbar spoke, each detail reinforcing his earlier suspicion that the attack on Camp Ironmore was far more calculated than a simple territorial raid. Someone with intimate knowledge of the base's history was orchestrating events from the shadows, using fear and coercion to manipulate vulnerable soldiers into providing critical information. "This changes things," Vane said quietly, turning to Whitfield. "Whoever is behind this isn't interested in random destruction. They're building towards something specific, and Dunbar's information suggests they've been planning this for a long time." Whitfield's frustration slowly shifted into concern as the implications settled over him. If Dunbar was providing information under duress, will his cooperation now help us identify who's really behind this? "It's a start," Vane replied, "but we need to move carefully. Whoever is orchestrating this clearly has resources and patience most raiders wouldn't bother with." Over the following days, Vane worked closely with select officers to quietly investigate the deeper implications of Dunbar's confession, piecing together fragments of information that painted a troubling picture. The attacks on Camp Ironmore were not isolated incidents but part of a larger pattern targeting several military outposts across the region, each attack seemingly designed to weaken defenses gradually, rather than through direct confrontation. During one such investigation, Vane and Dillon reviewed old maps and reports late into the night, searching for connections between seemingly unrelated incidents. Dillon, still adjusting to his expanded role within the investigation, glanced toward Vane with growing curiosity. "You really think all of this connects back to whoever attacked the outpost 6 years ago?" Dillon asked. Vane's expression grew distant, memories clearly resurfacing from that painful chapter of his past. "The tactics feel familiar. Patient, calculated, designed to exploit weaknesses rather than confront strength directly. It's a strategy I've seen before, one that nearly destroyed this base once already." Dillon hesitated before asking the question that had been lingering in his mind since Vane's return. "Do you know who was really behind that attack?" Vane's jaw tightened, his gaze hardening into something colder, more determined. "I have suspicions, but proving them will require patience, and unfortunately, patience is a luxury we might not have much longer." As if summoned by his words, an urgent alert interrupted their conversation. A soldier rushing into the room with news that would soon confirm Vane's growing fears. A neighboring outpost, similar in size and strategic importance to Camp Ironmore, had just come under a coordinated assault, far larger and more devastating than anything experienced that night. Vane rose immediately, his expression shifting into sharp focus, the calm patience of investigation replaced by the urgent clarity of impending confrontation. "This is only the beginning," Vane said grimly. "Whoever orchestrated tonight's attack is preparing for something much larger, and Camp Ironmore may be next." Whitfield, informed quickly of the developing situation, called an emergency meeting, gathering senior officers and key personnel within the command hall. Tension filled the room as Vane outlined the growing threat, connecting fragmented pieces of information into a clearer, more alarming picture. "We need to prepare for a direct assault, not another isolated raid," Vane explained. "Whoever is behind this has been testing our defenses, gathering intelligence, and manipulating vulnerable soldiers to weaken us from within. Their next move will likely be far more aggressive." Reggie, still skeptical despite recent events, crossed his arms. "And you're certain about this because of your past experience alone?" "I'm certain because I've seen this exact strategy before," Vane replied firmly. "It's the same approach used against the outpost 6 years ago, refined and expanded. Whoever is responsible learned from that encounter, and now they're applying those lessons on a much larger scale." The room absorbed his words in tense silence, the reality of an impending large-scale attack settling heavily over everyone present. Whitfield, though still cautious about fully relinquishing control, recognized the necessity of relying on Vane's expertise moving forward. "What do you suggest?" Whitfield finally asked. Vane studied the map spread across the table, tracing potential defensive strategies with careful precision. "We reinforce weak points immediately, particularly areas exposed during tonight's incident. We also need to identify who exactly is orchestrating these attacks before they gather enough strength to strike Camp Ironmore directly." As officers began coordinating defensive preparations, Dillon approached Vane quietly, sensing the weight of unspoken history behind his determination. "This is personal for you." isn't it? Vane's gaze remained fixed on the map, his expression carrying years of buried grief and unresolved anger. 6 years ago, I lost soldiers I considered family because I underestimated the patience of our enemy. I won't make that mistake again. Dylan nodded solemnly, understanding now why the empty chair had carried such profound significance for so long. It wasn't merely a symbol of loss, but a promise of unfinished responsibility, one Vane was clearly determined to fulfill no matter the cost. As preparations intensified throughout Camp Ironmore, an unsettling realization began to take root among the soldiers and officers alike. Tonight's victory, however significant, was merely the opening move in a much larger, more dangerous confrontation, and at the center of it all stood Vane, carrying both the weight of his legendary past and the uncertain challenges of the battle still to come. 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Camp Ironmore transformed under Vane's guidance, weak points along the perimeter reinforced, patrol patterns adjusted to eliminate predictable gaps, and communication systems upgraded to prevent further leaks of sensitive information. Soldiers who once whispered doubts about the empty chair now moved with renewed purpose, inspired by the quiet confidence Vane carried into every decision. Dylan barely slept, splitting his time between training exercises and continued investigation alongside Vane, piecing together fragments of intelligence gathered from Dunbar's confession and intercepted communications. Slowly, a name began to surface repeatedly across various reports, a figure known only by the codename Ashwood, believed to be coordinating the coordinated assaults across the region. Ashwood isn't just a raider leader, Vane explained during a late-night briefing with senior officers. The tactics, the patience, the deliberate targeting of infrastructure rather than direct combat. This is someone with military training, likely someone who once served within a structure similar to ours. Whitfield frowned, arms crossed as he studied the growing collection of evidence spread across the table. You think Ashwood might have connections to the very outpost you lost 6 years ago? Vane's expression darkened, memories clearly resurfacing with painful clarity. I think it's possible. Ashwood was present that night, someone who witnessed the outpost's fall, and later chose to weaponize that experience rather than move past it. The room absorbed his words in heavy silence, the implications settling over everyone present. If Vane's theory proved accurate, tonight's looming confrontation would not merely be a battle against an unknown enemy, but a painful reckoning with unresolved history. As preparations continued, tension within the base grew increasingly palpable. Soldiers trained harder, officers coordinated more closely, and an undeniable sense of anticipation settled over Camp Ironmore, everyone acutely aware that the coming confrontation would define the future of the base entirely. On the 4th night, the attack finally came. It began not with the chaotic bursts of gunfire experienced during the earlier raid, but with a deliberate, coordinated assault targeting multiple points around the base simultaneously. Explosions rocked the perimeter fences as soldiers scrambled into defensive positions, following the carefully rehearsed strategies developed under Vane's guidance over the previous days. Vane moved through the chaos with practiced precision, coordinating defenses while personally leading soldiers toward the most critical breach points. Dylan fought alongside him, adrenaline surging through his veins as months of training finally met the harsh reality of combat. "Hold the eastern line," Vane shouted over the roar of gunfire and explosions. "Whitfield, reinforce the fuel depot immediately. That's their primary target." Whitfield, coordinating from the command hall, quickly redirected available forces toward the depot, trusting Vane's judgment, despite the overwhelming chaos surrounding them. As soldiers scrambled into position, a figure emerged from the smoke near the depot entrance, moving with a calculated calm that immediately caught Vane's attention. The figure wore no mask this time, revealing a face marked by old scars and a haunted, determined expression. Vane's breath caught as recognition settled over him, memories from 6 years ago flooding back with painful clarity. "Ashwood," Vane said quietly, the name carrying years of buried grief and unresolved anger. Ashwood's eyes locked onto Vane, a bitter smile forming across his weathered face. "I wondered if you'd survive long enough to see this moment. 6 years, and you still cling to the illusion that this base is worth protecting. You were one of us once," Vane said, his voice steady, despite the storm of emotions clearly churning beneath the surface. "What happened to you?" Ashwood's expression hardened, years of buried resentment surfacing violently. "I watched everyone I cared about die that night, while Command hesitated, too afraid to act until it was too late. You call this base worth protecting, but it's built on the graves of people who deserved better." "I didn't hesitate," Vane replied firmly. "I lost people that night too, people I would have given anything to save." "But you survived," Ashwood spat bitterly, "and instead of learning from that failure, you built a legend around it. A chair kept empty in your honor, while the rest of us who suffered were forgotten." Vane's expression softened slightly, understanding now the painful root of Ashwood's transformation, though it did nothing to excuse the destruction he had orchestrated since. "Revenge won't undo what happened that night. It will only create more empty chairs, more grieving families." Ashwood's grip tightened around the weapon in his hand, years of anger and grief finally boiling over into violent resolve. "Then let this base burn alongside every promise it failed to keep." The confrontation quickly escalated, soldiers on both sides engaging in intense combat around the depot, as Vane and Ashwood faced each other directly, years of unresolved history colliding in a decisive confrontation. Dylan, fighting nearby, watched with a mixture of awe and fear as the two former comrades clashed with skill far beyond anything he had witnessed before. Vane fought defensively at first, clearly reluctant to cause serious harm to someone he once considered family, despite the destruction Ashwood had caused. But as the confrontation intensified, it became increasingly clear that Ashwood had no intention of backing down, his grief long since transformed into an unrelenting desire for destruction. "You don't have to do this," Vane said, deflecting another attack with practiced precision. "There's still time to stop, to find another way forward." "There is no other way," Ashwood snarled, pressing his assault with renewed intensity. "Not anymore." As their confrontation continued, the surrounding battle reached a critical turning point. Reinforced defenses coordinated under Vane's earlier guidance began to overwhelm Ashwood's forces, soldiers systematically securing key points around the base, despite the chaos still raging around the depot. Whitfield, monitoring the situation from the command hall, made a difficult decision, authorizing a coordinated push to isolate Ashwood's remaining forces and cut off any possibility of retreat. Slowly, the tide of battle shifted decisively in favor of Camp Ironmore, soldiers rallying behind the strategies developed under Vane's careful preparation. Recognizing the shifting momentum, Ashwood's expression twisted into desperate frustration, his earlier confidence crumbling under the weight of inevitable defeat. Yet even as his forces faltered, he refused to abandon his confrontation with Vane, driven by years of unresolved anger that demanded resolution regardless of the outcome. "This ends tonight," Ashwood said, launching a final, desperate assault. Vane met the attack head-on, years of experience and quiet determination guiding his movements with practiced precision. The confrontation reached its climax in a brief, intense exchange, ending with Ashwood disarmed and subdued, his desperate struggle finally giving way to exhausted defeat. As soldiers moved in to secure him, Ashwood's expression shifted from anger into something closer to grief, the weight of years spent consumed by vengeance finally settling over him in the aftermath of failure. "You could have stopped this years ago," Ashwood said quietly, voice trembling with exhaustion. "Why didn't you come back sooner?" Vane knelt beside him, expression heavy with genuine sorrow despite the destruction Ashwood had caused. "I wanted to. Circumstances kept me away far longer than I intended. I'm sorry I couldn't return in time to stop you from becoming this." Ashwood said nothing further, allowing himself to be led away under guard, his resistance finally broken by the crushing reality of his failed campaign. Around them, the sounds of battle gradually faded into an exhausted, uneasy silence, soldiers slowly realizing that Camp Ironmore had survived its greatest test yet. Dylan approached Vane slowly, still processing the intensity of everything he had just witnessed. "Is it over?" Vane's gaze lingered on Ashwood's retreating figure, a complicated mixture of relief and lingering sorrow reflected in his tired eyes. "The fighting is over, but the consequences of tonight will take much longer to fully understand." As dawn began to break over Camp Ironmore, soldiers slowly emerged from their defensive positions, surveying the aftermath of the battle, with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. Smoke still rose from scattered points along the perimeter, but the base had held, its defenses proving strong enough to withstand the most significant threat it had faced in years. Whitfield, emerging from the command hall, approached Vane with an expression carrying newfound respect, the earlier tension between them softened by the shared relief of survival. "You saved this base tonight. Saved all of us." Vane shook his head slightly, his expression carrying the weight of complicated emotions rather than simple pride. "We saved it together. Tonight wasn't about proving legends true. It was about protecting people who deserved better than becoming casualties of someone else's unresolved grief." As soldiers began the exhausting process of securing the base and tending to the wounded, whispers slowly spread among them, stories of Vane's decisive leadership mixing with newfound respect for the quiet warrior who had returned when Camp Ironmore needed him most. The empty chair that once symbolized uncertain hope now carried a different weight entirely, no longer a relic of forgotten mockery, but a promise finally fulfilled. Yet even amid the relief of survival, Vane's expression remained heavy with unresolved questions, memories of Ashwood's bitter accusations lingering long after the battle's end. Somewhere beneath the exhaustion and relief, a quiet resolve began forming within him, a renewed determination to ensure that Camp Ironmore's future would honor not just its legends, but the painful lessons learned from its past. The days following the battle passed slowly, Camp Ironmore gradually shifting from the chaos of survival into the quieter, more difficult work of recovery. Damaged sections of the perimeter fence were rebuilt, wounded soldiers received extended care within the medical unit, and the base settled into an uneasy but hopeful rhythm as life slowly returned to something resembling normalcy. Vane spent much of this time working closely with Whitfield, helping restructure the base's defenses to prevent future vulnerabilities from being exploited so easily again. Their earlier tension had softened considerably, replaced by a mutual respect forged through shared hardship. Whitfield, though initially reluctant to accept Vane's return, now openly acknowledged the invaluable role he had played in protecting Camp Ironmore. "I spent years trying to move this base beyond dependence on legends," Whitfield admitted during one quiet evening discussion. "I thought stability meant leaving the past behind entirely." "Stability doesn't mean forgetting," Vane replied thoughtfully. "It means learning from what came before, without letting it control what comes next." Whitfield nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of Vane's words. "The chair stays occupied then." Vane's gaze drifted toward the command hall, where the once empty seat now carried a very different significance among the soldiers stationed at Camp Ironmore. Only if it continues to represent something worth protecting, not just a symbol of loss. As recovery efforts continued, Dylan found himself increasingly drawn into deeper conversations with Vane, their shared experiences during the battle creating a bond neither had expected. One afternoon, as they walked along the newly reinforced perimeter, Dylan finally voiced a question that had lingered in his mind since Ashwood's capture. "What happens to him now? Ashwood, I mean." Vane's expression grew contemplative, the weight of complicated emotions still evident, despite the passing days. "He'll face consequences for what he's done, but I intend to advocate for understanding, alongside accountability." His actions were inexcusable, but his grief was real. Perhaps with time, there's still a path toward redemption, even if it takes years to walk. Dylan considered this for a long moment, before nodding slowly, understanding now the depth of compassion that had defined Vane's leadership throughout the crisis. It wasn't simply skill or strategy that had earned him such profound respect among the soldiers of Camp Ironmore, but a genuine commitment to protecting people, even those who had once stood against him. As weeks passed, Camp Ironmore gradually transformed under the combined leadership of Vane and Whitfield, becoming stronger and more unified than it had been in years. Soldiers who once dismissed the empty chair as an outdated superstition now spoke of it with genuine reverence, understanding at last the profound sacrifice and unwavering dedication it represented. Dylan's mother, upon learning of Vane's return, visited the base for the first time in years, her reunion with him marked by quiet tears and unspoken relief. Their conversation, private and deeply emotional, remained largely unknown to others at the base, but Dylan noticed a subtle shift in his mother afterward, a heaviness lifted from her shoulders that had lingered since that fateful night 6 years earlier. "She never stopped believing you'd come back," Dylan told Vane later, watching as his mother returned to her medical duties with renewed lightness in her step. "She kept this base alive in more ways than she probably realizes," Vane replied softly. "Her strength during that first crisis inspired countless soldiers to keep fighting, even when hope seemed impossible." As Camp Ironmore settled into its new rhythm, a formal ceremony was organized to honor those who had fought valiantly during the recent battle, celebrating both the soldiers who had defended the base and the difficult sacrifices made by those affected by Ashwood's campaign of vengeance. Soldiers gathered within the command hall, the atmosphere charged with a mixture of solemn respect and quiet hope for the future. Whitfield addressed the assembled soldiers, his voice carrying genuine gratitude rather than the guarded authority he once relied upon. 6 years ago, this base learned what it meant to lose someone irreplaceable. Tonight, we celebrate not just survival, but the strength found in remembering our past while building toward a better future. As the ceremony continued, Whitfield turned toward Vane, gesturing toward the long empty chair that had remained a silent symbol throughout the base's difficult history. "It's time this base finally welcomes its legend home, not as a myth, but as the leader he's always been." The room fell into respectful silence as Vane stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the soldiers gathered before him, many of whom had once doubted his existence entirely. Slowly, deliberately, he approached the chair that had waited patiently for his return through 6 long years of uncertainty and loss. As he lowered himself into the seat, a wave of quiet emotion swept through the room, soldiers standing a little straighter, their earlier doubts replaced entirely by genuine respect and admiration. The empty seat, once mocked and dismissed by those who never understood its true significance, finally held the man it had always been meant for. Dylan watched from the crowd, pride swelling within his chest, as he witnessed the culmination of everything Camp Ironmore had endured over the past several weeks. The legend he had grown up hearing about, distant and almost mythical, now sat before him as something far more meaningful, a man defined not by flawless invincibility, but by unwavering dedication, humility, and genuine compassion even toward those who had wronged him. As the ceremony concluded and soldiers slowly dispersed, Vane remained seated for a long moment, quietly reflecting on the journey that had brought him back to this place. Memories of fallen comrades, painful years of captivity, and the difficult reunion with Ashwood's tragic transformation all lingered within him, shaping a wisdom far deeper than simple combat skill alone. Dylan approached him quietly once the hall had mostly emptied, sitting nearby in comfortable silence for several minutes before finally speaking. "Do you think Ashwood can really change?" Dylan asked. Vane considered the question carefully, his gaze distant yet thoughtful. "People are capable of remarkable change, given enough time, patience, and genuine support. I choose to believe redemption remains possible, even after significant mistakes. It's a belief that kept me going during my own darkest moments." Dylan nodded, absorbing the depth of wisdom behind Vane's words. "The camp is different now, stronger, I think, because of you." Vane offered a small, genuine smile, one carrying none of the weary caution from his earlier arrival. "Because of all of us. Strength like this doesn't come from a single person alone. It comes from a community willing to support each other through even the darkest circumstances." As evening settled over Camp Ironmore, soldiers moved about their duties with renewed purpose, the earlier atmosphere of doubt and mockery entirely replaced by genuine respect and unity. The empty chair, once a quiet source of division and skepticism, now stood as a powerful symbol of resilience, reminding everyone within the base that legends were not simply stories passed down through time, but living testaments to sacrifice, redemption, and unwavering hope. Vane remained at Camp Ironmore in the months that followed, gradually rebuilding trust not only within the base itself, but throughout the surrounding region affected by Ashwood's campaign of vengeance. His leadership, defined by quiet strength and genuine compassion, transformed Camp Ironmore into a stronger, more unified community than it had ever been before. Years later, new recruits arriving at the base would hear the story of the empty chair, no longer told as distant folklore, but as living history, a powerful reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, hope and redemption remained possible for those brave enough to hold on to them. And through it all, the chair that once stood empty, mocked, and doubted, remained steadily occupied, a permanent symbol of the warrior who proved that legends, however distant they may seem, are capable of returning exactly when they're needed most.